This is the story of a book that has been studied for more than a century by historians, cryptographers, and even artificial intelligence. Yet no one has ever been able to read it. And if its pages really do contain a message, humanity has been staring at it for over 600 years without understanding a single word. In 1912, a rare book dealer named Wilfred Voynich purchased a collection of ancient manuscripts. Hidden among them was one book unlike anything he'd ever seen. At first, it didn't seem unusual. Its pages were filled with neat handwriting, detailed illustrations, complex diagrams. But there was one problem. No one could read it. The writing wasn't Latin, or Greek, or Arabic. It didn't match any known alphabet. Every page was covered with strange symbols, arranged in repeating patterns, almost as if they formed real words, real sentences, a real language, but one that had never been seen before. Then there were the illustrations, plants that don't exist, constellations no one could identify, circular diagrams that resembled maps, or machines, or something else entirely. And perhaps the strangest images of all, women bathing in green pools, connected by winding tubes and impossible plumbing, as though the book were describing a world that obeyed different rules. Researchers eventually dated the manuscript to the early 1400s, meaning it had already existed for centuries before Voynich ever found it. Since then, some of the world's greatest codebreakers have tried to unlock its secrets, including experts who deciphered enemy communications during World War II. They failed. Linguists failed. Historians failed. Even modern artificial intelligence has analyzed the text, searching for hidden patterns, looking for any clue that might reveal what it says. Still, no one has translated a single sentence with certainty. Some researchers believe the manuscript is an elaborate hoax, a meaningless collection of symbols designed to fool wealthy collectors. But others disagree. They argue the text follows statistical patterns remarkably similar to real languages. Patterns that would have been almost impossible to fake hundreds of years ago. Which leaves one unsettling possibility. The manuscript really does say something. We just don't know how to read it. Today, the Voynich Manuscript rests quietly inside a library. Hundreds of pages, thousands of carefully written words, waiting for someone to finally understand them. Because somewhere inside that book, there could be a message that humanity has been looking at for 6 centuries without ever knowing what it says. This is the story of a quiet American town where people began waking up in the middle of the night, unable to move. They all described the same strange smell. Many claimed they saw the same shadow outside their windows. Police searched for an attacker, but they never found one. And to this day, no one can say whether the town was hunted by a criminal or by fear itself. In the summer of 1944, the residents of Mattoon began reporting a series of bizarre nighttime attacks. The first victims told police they had been asleep when an unusual odor drifted into their homes. Some described it as sweet. Others said it smelled chemical or strangely sickening. Within minutes, they began feeling ill. Nausea, dizziness, a burning sensation in the throat. Then something even more frightening happened. Several victims said they couldn't move. Their arms felt heavy. Their legs refused to respond. Some believed they were completely paralyzed. As news of the attacks spread, more reports followed. And then came the eyewitnesses. Several residents claimed they had looked out their windows and spotted a tall figure standing in the darkness. A man dressed in dark clothing, watching the house. The moment he realized he had been seen, he disappeared into the night. Now panic spread much faster than the alleged attacker ever could. Families locked their doors before sunset. Windows were sealed shut. Neighbors stayed awake through the night, waiting for the next attack. Some residents armed themselves, patrolling the streets until dawn. Local newspapers gave the mysterious suspect a name that would become famous: the Mad Gasser of Mattoon. Police launched a full investigation. They interviewed witnesses, collected statements, searched neighborhoods, but every lead ended the same way. No chemicals, no signs of forced entry, no reliable suspect. Nothing. And yet, the reports continued. Night after night, new victims came forward with eerily similar stories. Then, just as suddenly as the incidents had begun, they stopped. No final attack, no arrest, no explanation. Just silence. As investigators reviewed the case, some proposed a surprising theory. What if there had never been a gas attacker at all? They suggested the town had experienced something known as mass psychogenic illness, sometimes called mass hysteria, where anxiety and fear spread rapidly through a community, leading people to experience genuine physical symptoms without a single external cause. It was an explanation that fit some of the evidence, but not all of it, because many residents insisted they hadn't imagined anything. They said they smelled the gas. They felt the paralysis. Some were convinced they saw someone standing outside their homes, and those eyewitness accounts have kept the mystery alive for decades. So what really happened in Mattoon during the summer of 1944? Was there a real attacker who somehow left no trace? Or did fear itself become so powerful that an entire town experienced the same nightmare? Whatever the answer, one thing has never changed. The Mad Gasser was never identified, and the mystery still lingers. Not because of what police found, but because of what they never did. This is the story of a ship that may never have existed. A ship that reportedly sent one of the most chilling distress calls ever recorded. A message so disturbing that by the time help arrived, everyone on board was dead. And moments later, the ship itself disappeared beneath the sea. In the late 1940s, ships sailing through the Strait of Malacca suddenly picked up a weak radio transmission. The signal was fading, barely audible, but the words came through clearly enough. The message said, "All officers, including captain, are dead, lying in chart room and bridge, possibly whole crew dead." Then, nothing. For a few seconds, only static, until one final sentence broke through the silence. "I die." And then, the transmission ended. Nearby ships immediately changed course. One vessel, the Silver Star, was reportedly the first to reach the source of the distress signal. As its crew climbed aboard, they expected to find survivors. Instead, they found silence. The vessel was identified as the SS Orang Medan. From a distance, nothing seemed unusual. There were no signs of a collision, no evidence of fire, no storm damage. Everything looked normal. Until they found the crew. Every person on board was dead. Some lay where they had been working. Others were collapsed on the deck. Their eyes were open, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Several appeared to be staring upward, as though they had witnessed something above them in their final moments. Even the ship's dog had died. And yet, there wasn't a single visible injury. No gunshots, no stab wounds, no obvious cause of death. It was as if whatever had happened had left no mark. The rescuers decided to tow the mysterious ship back to port. But before they could secure it, someone noticed smoke drifting from one of the cargo holds. At first, it was just a thin stream. Then it grew thicker. The captain of the Silver Star ordered his crew back to their ship immediately. Minutes later, the SS Orang Medan exploded. A massive blast tore through the vessel. Within moments, it slipped beneath the surface, taking every remaining clue with it. And that's where the mystery truly begins. Because despite decades of investigation, no confirmed wreck has ever been found. Some historians argue the entire story was fabricated, pointing out inconsistencies in shipping records and a lack of official documentation. Others believe there really was a ship, perhaps carrying dangerous chemicals that released toxic gases, or even transporting secret wartime cargo. Without physical evidence, no one can say for certain. If the story is true, then an entire crew died under circumstances no one has ever explained. If it isn't, then one of the greatest maritime legends ever told somehow convinced generations that it really happened. Either way, one detail continues to haunt the story. Someone survived long enough to send that final message, and whatever they saw went to the bottom of the sea with them.
The train pulled into the station, but it wasn't on the schedule. In 1972, commuters waiting at a small rural station in Italy reported something impossible. At 11:04 p.m., a train entered the platform. The problem was simple. No train was scheduled that night. The station master checked the logs twice. No late arrivals, no reroutes. Yet the train was there. It was old-fashioned. Dim interior lights, curtains drawn over the windows. It stopped without a sound. The doors opened. No conductor stepped out. No announcements were made. A few passengers on the platform approached cautiously. Inside, the seats were filled, but the people sitting there weren't moving. They stared forward, perfectly still. One witness later said their faces looked pale, almost gray. One witness later said their faces looked pale, almost gray. After less than a minute, the doors closed. The train pulled away without making a sound. Railway control later confirmed no train had passed through that track. No signal activation, no weight detection, nothing. Days later, a missing persons report surfaced from a nearby town. A group of factory workers had disappeared after boarding a late-night train 2 weeks earlier. The description of the train matched perfectly. No wreckage was ever found, no bodies recovered, and no explanation given. To this day, locals claim that if you stand on that same platform just after 11 p.m., you might see headlights approaching in the distance, but no train will ever be listed on the board. And if the doors open, you shouldn't get on.
In August of 1994, in a small, quiet town called Oakville, Washington, it started to rain. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Just a light drizzle falling from a gray sky. But then people began to notice something off. When the rain hit the ground, it didn't splash, it clumped. Tiny, clear blobs started covering everything. Driveways, cars, roofs, even people. They looked like jelly. Sticky, translucent, about the size of rice grains. At first, some residents laughed it off. They thought maybe it was pollution or some kind of natural buildup, until they touched it. Because within hours, people all over town started getting sick. It began with flu-like symptoms, fever, fatigue, nausea. But then it got worse. Some people had trouble breathing. Others became so weak, they couldn't even get out of bed. A few ended up in the hospital, and that's when one resident decided to take things seriously. She collected some of the blobs and sent them to a lab for testing. What came back only made things more confusing, because according to reports, the substance contained human white blood cells. Now think about that. Human cells falling from the sky. No one could explain it. And the strangest part? The rain didn't stop. For 3 days, on and off, and those same gelatinous blobs kept falling over Oakville. Then suddenly, it was over. The sky cleared. The blobs disappeared. And just like that, It never happened again. But the questions remained. Some people believed it was a secret military experiment gone wrong. Others thought it had fallen from passing aircraft, and a few feared something biological had been released into the air. Officials never gave a clear answer. No official explanation, no confirmed reports. And the samples that were tested, they were lost. To this day, no one knows what really fell over Oakville. But the people who were there still remember the week it rained something that wasn't rain. Because whatever those blobs were, they didn't behave like weather. They didn't look natural. And they definitely didn't feel like something that came from the clouds. Which raises one very uncomfortable question. If it didn't come from the sky, then where did it come from? In 1943, at the height of World War II, the US military was locked in a desperate race for technological superiority. Because whoever controlled the most advanced weapons controlled the outcome of the war. And according to one story, one experiment may have gone too far. It supposedly happened at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard on a ship called the USS Eldridge. Now, officially, the Eldridge was just a regular Navy destroyer escort. Nothing unusual. But years later, people would claim that wasn't true. They said the Navy had been secretly working on something called Project Rainbow, an experiment designed to make ships invisible, not just to radar, but to the human eye. So on the day of the test, the Eldridge sat quietly in the water. And then, without warning, massive generators on board powered up. Witnesses nearby said they could hear a low electric hum, growing louder and louder, until suddenly, the ship was surrounded by a thick, greenish fog. At first it just clung to the hull, then it spread, engulfing the entire vessel, and then the USS Eldridge disappeared completely. Not faded, not hidden, gone. Now, if that was the end of the story, it would already be unbelievable. But according to the legend, it gets much worse. Because moments later, the same ship was reportedly seen over 200 miles away, in Norfolk, Virginia. Just sitting there, as if it had always been there. And then, just as suddenly, it vanished again, only to reappear back in Philadelphia, exactly where it started. But when the ship came back, something was horribly wrong. Crew members stumbled off the deck, disoriented, violently sick. Some couldn't speak. Others couldn't even recognize where they were. A few were said to have lost their minds completely. But the most disturbing claims were about the sailors who never made it off the ship, because according to witnesses, some of them had become part of it. Bodies partially embedded in the metal hull, arms fused into walls, legs trapped inside the deck, alive but unable to move, screaming until they weren't. Now, the US Navy has always denied this story. Historians say there's no credible evidence that anything like this ever happened, and most believe the entire tale came from a series of hoaxes, misunderstandings, and exaggerated wartime rumors. But here's the thing. During World War II, the military was experimenting with advanced technology. Radar invisibility, electromagnetic fields, highly classified projects. So while the Philadelphia experiment, as it's told, is almost certainly not real, it exists just close enough to reality to make you wonder. Because if you push science far enough, if you start trying to bend light to hide entire ships, at what point do you risk bending something else? Something you can't control. Something like reality itself. This is a story about a group of men who agreed to participate in medical tests because they were told it was safe, they were told it was simple, and they were told they'd be paid. But what they didn't know was that their bodies were about to become a testing ground for some of the most dangerous substances ever used on humans. For decades, inside Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia, inmates were given an unusual opportunity: sign up for medical research, and in return, receive small rewards, a few dollars. Soap, cigarettes. For men with almost nothing, this felt like a lifeline. So they volunteered, again and again. At first, the tests seemed minor: creams applied to the skin, patches taped to their backs, nothing too extreme. But those creams weren't harmless. And those patches weren't just patches. They were soaked in chemicals, left in place for days, slowly burning into the skin. Some inmates developed severe rashes that spread across their bodies. Others suffered open sores, raw, painful wounds that refused to heal. And for many, the damage didn't go away. Scars formed, skin conditions lingered. Some would carry the effects for the rest of their lives. But even that was only the beginning. Because behind these experiments was a man named Albert Kligman, a respected dermatologist who saw Holmesburg Prison not as a correctional facility, but as a perfect laboratory. Under his direction, researchers began testing more than just cosmetics. They introduced powerful chemicals, experimental drugs, substances that had never been approved for human use. At one point, prisoners were exposed to dioxin, a highly toxic compound later linked to cancer and long-term organ damage. And still, the experiments continued. Now, technically, the inmates had consented, but that word didn't mean what it should have. Some prisoners couldn't even read the forms they signed. Others didn't fully understand what they were agreeing to. And many felt like they didn't really have a choice at all. Because when you're locked behind bars, with limited options, even a dangerous offer can feel like the only one. So they kept signing up, and their bodies kept paying the price. These experiments went on from the 1950s into the 1970s. For years, almost no one outside the prison knew what was happening, until finally, investigations began to uncover the truth. And when former inmates started speaking out, the stories were horrifying. Men described unbearable pain, disfigurement, chronic conditions that never healed. They had agreed to participate in tests, but no one told them they were the test. Because inside Holmesburg Prison, their punishment wasn't just time. It was exposure. It was suffering. It was being turned into something less than human. And it revealed a chilling reality: that sometimes the most dangerous experiments don't happen in secret labs. They happen in places where no one is looking. This is a story about a place where parents sent their children because they believed it was the safest option. But behind closed doors, those same children were used in a medical experiment they could never understand and could never escape. In the 1950s, there was a place in New York that most people had never heard of, and the people inside it were rarely seen again. It was called Willowbrook State School. From the outside, it looked like a hospital, a place where children, especially those with developmental disabilities, would be cared for, protected. But inside, it was a completely different story. The facility was severely overcrowded. Rooms meant for a handful of children held dozens. Staff were overwhelmed. Resources were stretched thin. And disease spread easily, especially hepatitis. Now, for most people, that would be a crisis. But for some doctors at Willowbrook, it was an opportunity. They wanted to understand hepatitis, how it spread, how it developed, and what it did to the human body over time. And to do that, they needed subjects. So when new parents arrived, hoping to admit their child into the facility, they were often told something devastating. There are no available spots, unless they agreed to enroll their child in a special medical program, a study. For many families, this didn't feel like a choice. They were desperate. They needed help. So they signed the papers, trusting the doctors, believing this would lead to better care, better treatment. But that's not what happened, because once inside the study, those children were deliberately exposed to hepatitis. Some were fed substances made from the stool of infected patients. Others were injected directly. And then, they were watched closely. Doctors recorded everything. The first signs of illness, the progression of symptoms, the long-term effects on their bodies, from beginning to end. Now, the researchers had a justification. They argued that hepatitis was already widespread inside Willowbrook, that most children would become infected anyway. So in their minds, this wasn't cruelty, it was control. A way to study the disease under predictable conditions. But here's the problem. Those children didn't choose this. They didn't understand what was happening. And they had no way to say no. For over a decade, the study continued, quietly, hidden from the public, until finally, journalists began to investigate. And what they found shocked the nation. Images of the conditions inside Willowbrook, the overcrowding, the neglect, the experiments, sparked outrage. There were lawsuits, government investigations, promises of reform, and eventually, the study was shut down. But for many of those children, the damage had already been done. Physically, emotionally, permanently, because they had never been treated like patients. Or even like children. They had been treated like data, like a means to an end. And it revealed something deeply unsettling. That sometimes, the place you're told is safest, the place meant to heal you, can become the place where the most harm is done. Full video waiting in the comments. Smash like, share with friends, and tell me what you think. This is a story about people who volunteered for what they believed were harmless psychological studies. But without their knowledge, their thoughts, their memories, even their sense of reality, were being manipulated by one of the most powerful agencies in the world. And by the time some of them realized what was happening, it was already too late. In the 1950s, at the height of the Cold War, the United States was gripped by a very specific fear that its enemies, especially the Soviet Union, had discovered a way to control the human mind. So in response, the CIA launched a classified program known as MK Ultra. Its objective sounded like something straight out of science fiction. Figure out how to control human behavior. Completely. Now, to do this, the CIA didn't just run experiments inside government facilities. They spread them out. Universities, hospitals, prisons, often without telling anyone involved what was really happening, because the people participating in these studies had no idea they were part of something much bigger. They thought they were helping with research. They thought they were safe. They were wrong. Some subjects were secretly given LSD, not once, but repeatedly, sometimes for days at a time. Others were placed in isolation, cut off from all light, all sound, left alone with their thoughts until their minds began to break down. There were experiments involving hypnosis, sleep deprivation, intense psychological pressure designed to push people past their limits. The goal was simple: strip the mind down to nothing, and then see if it could be rebuilt, controlled. Now, for many of the victims, the effects didn't end when the experiment did. Some suffered long-term psychological damage, confusion, paranoia, a loss of identity they could never fully recover from. And in at least one case, the consequences were fatal. A man named Frank Olson was a government scientist working with the US military. One day, without his knowledge, he was given LSD. In the days that followed, his behavior changed dramatically. He became paranoid, disoriented, terrified. And then, just days later, he fell from a hotel window to his death. At the time, his family was told it was suicide, and for years, that's all they knew. Until decades later, declassified documents revealed the truth, that he had been part of a secret experiment, that his mind had been altered without his consent. MKUltra continued for more than 20 years, and when investigations finally began in the 1970s, the CIA took action, not to explain, not to apologize, but to erase. Thousands of files destroyed, gone, leaving behind only fragments of what really happened. But those fragments were enough to reveal something deeply unsettling. That real people had their minds experimented on, not overseas, not in enemy territory, but at home, by their own government. Because the most terrifying place to lose control isn't where you are. It's inside your own head. At some point in the mid-1900s, according to a story that spread across the internet, 5 prisoners in the Soviet Union were given a choice: freedom or an experiment. All they had to do was stay awake for 30 days. No sleep, not even for a moment. They were locked inside a sealed chamber with just enough food, water, and oxygen to survive. But there was one more thing inside that room: a special gas, one designed to keep them awake. For the first few days, everything seemed normal. The prisoners talked to each other, they joked, shared stories, even laughed. Researchers monitored them through microphones because there were no cameras inside the chamber. And at first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But by day 5, things began to change. The conversations became darker, more paranoid. They started whispering, accusing each other of things that didn't make sense. By day 9, one of the prisoners suddenly began screaming, not shouting, not yelling, screaming, for hours, non-stop, until eventually, his voice just gave out, completely. After that, the others stopped speaking. No sound, no movement, nothing. It went on like that for days, until the researchers finally decided to check on them. On day 15, they opened the chamber, and what they found inside didn't make sense. The prisoners were still alive, but barely. Their bodies had been destroyed, flesh torn away, self-inflicted injuries that no one could explain. And the strangest part, they refused to leave. When soldiers tried to remove them, the prisoners fought back, desperate, not to escape, but to stay inside, to stay awake. They begged for more of the gas, screaming that they needed it, that they couldn't go back to sleep, because when they did, they saw something waiting for them in the dark, something that only appears when you don't sleep. The experiment was shut down shortly after. Most of the prisoners died, but one reportedly survived, long enough to say one final thing. He looked at the researchers and whispered, "We are the ones you hide from when you go to sleep." Now, there's no evidence this experiment ever happened. No records, no documents, nothing to prove it's real, because it isn't. It's a creepypasta, an internet horror story. But the reason it spread so far and scared so many people is because it feels possible. Because history has shown that humans are capable of doing terrible things in the name of science. And once that idea gets into your head, it becomes a lot harder to sleep at night. A group of ordinary people agreed to take part in a harmless experiment, but within 48 hours, they stopped pretending. And what started as a game became disturbingly real. In 1971, inside the basement of Stanford University, a psychology study quietly began. Volunteers were recruited. They were told they would be part of a simulated prison experiment. Nothing dangerous, nothing extreme, just a study of behavior. They were even paid for their time. Then, without much ceremony, they were divided into two groups, guards and prisoners. The basement was transformed into a makeshift jail. Small cells, metal bars, uniforms, strict rules. Everything designed to feel real. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal. People laughed. They played along. It felt like acting. But then, something changed. Within just 48 hours, the guards began to shift. Their tone became sharper. Their orders more aggressive. They forced prisoners to do degrading tasks, stand for hours, clean toilets with their bare hands. They controlled when they could sleep and when they could eat. And the prisoners started to break. Some became quiet and withdrawn. Others cried uncontrollably. One prisoner suffered a full psychological breakdown, screaming, shaking, unable to separate the experiment from reality. He had to be removed, but the experiment didn't stop, and the guards only got worse, more controlling, more cruel. And here's what made it truly disturbing. No one told them to act like this. There were no instructions to be abusive, no script to follow. They chose it, on their own. The study was supposed to last 2 weeks. It didn't even make it to one. After just 6 days, it was shut down. Because what was happening inside that basement was no longer an experiment. It was real suffering, real psychological harm. And the researchers realized something they couldn't ignore. They weren't just observing behavior anymore. They were witnessing how quickly ordinary people can lose themselves when given power, and no consequences. Because sometimes, the monster isn't something that's created. It's something that was already there, waiting to be revealed. This is a story about a man who confessed to a brutal double murder, gave details only the killer should know, and was sentenced to the maximum punishment. But years later, science would prove he never did it. In the summer of 2000, in the country of Norway, 2 young girls went missing. A search began almost immediately, and before long, their bodies were found in a forested area known as Baneheia. The discovery shocked the nation. This wasn't just a crime, it was something far darker. Police launched an intense investigation, and very quickly, they focused on 2 men, Viggo Kristiansen and Jan Helge Andersen. Both had been in the area. Both became prime suspects. Now at first, neither man confessed, but after long, exhausting interrogations, that changed. Kristiansen admitted involvement. He gave a confession. And for investigators, that was everything. Because once someone confesses, the case feels solved. But almost immediately, there were problems. Details in his confession didn't line up with the evidence. Timelines shifted. Key facts were inconsistent. It was as if the story was being built piece by piece, instead of remembered. But despite those issues, the confession held weight, and in court, it was enough. Kristiansen was sentenced to 21 years in prison, the maximum penalty. Meanwhile, he continued to insist he was innocent. Year after year, from inside his cell, he kept saying the same thing. He didn't do it. And eventually, someone decided to take another look. Advances in forensic science allowed investigators to re-examine the DNA evidence from the crime scene, and what they found changed everything. The DNA didn't match Viggo Kristiansen, not even close. Then came another discovery, phone records. They showed that at the time of the murders, he wasn't where the crime happened. He wasn't even nearby. So the question became unavoidable. If he didn't do it, then why did he confess? The answer was deeply unsettling, because those interrogations weren't just conversations. They were hours of pressure, repeated questioning, subtle suggestions, leading prompts. Over time, investigators had unintentionally guided him, shaping his statements, nudging him toward a version of events that matched their theory, until eventually, his confession fit the crime, even though it wasn't real. In 2022, after more than 2 decades, his conviction was overturned, and Viggo Kristiansson walked free. Not because of a new witness, not because someone else confessed, but because the evidence, the science, had never supported his guilt in the first place, and it forced people to confront a disturbing truth, that sometimes the most convincing piece of evidence in a case is also the most dangerous. Because a confession doesn't always mean someone is guilty. Sometimes it just means they were broken. In 1939, in the United States, a group of researchers set out to study something that seemed harmless: stuttering. They wanted to understand why some people develop it and whether it could be controlled. So they designed an experiment. And to carry it out, they chose their subjects carefully. Not volunteers, not adults, children. 22 of them. All orphans, children with no parents, no one to advocate for them, and no way to say no. The researchers divided them into 2 groups. The first group was treated with kindness, encouraged, praised for how they spoke. Even when they made mistakes, they were reassured. But the second group was treated very differently. These children, some of whom spoke perfectly fine, were told something was wrong with them. Every time they spoke, they were interrupted, corrected, criticized. They were told they were developing a stutter, warned not to speak unless they were absolutely sure they wouldn't make a mistake. Day after day, the same pattern repeated. Negative feedback, constant pressure, relentless correction. And slowly, something began to change. The children who once spoke normally started to hesitate, pausing mid-sentence, second-guessing every word. Some stopped speaking altogether. They became anxious, withdrawn, afraid. Not because they couldn't speak, but because they believed they shouldn't. The damage wasn't temporary. For some of them, it lasted a lifetime. Speech problems, severe anxiety, a deep fear of saying the wrong thing. The experiment became known, years later, as the monster study. Not because of what it was studying, but because of what it did. Even the researchers at the time knew something wasn't right. The results were never published. The study was buried, hidden, until decades later, when the truth finally came out. And the former orphans, now adults, began to speak about what happened to them. About the shame, the fear, the silence that followed them for years. Because they weren't just part of a study, they were children who were taught to doubt their own voices, which leaves a question that's hard to ignore. If simply telling someone there's something wrong with them can change the way they think, the way they speak, the way they live, then how much damage can words really do? This is a story about a black bear that wandered into the woods one night and accidentally stumbled into the middle of a massive drug operation. By the time authorities found it, the bear was dead, and nearby were millions of dollars worth of cocaine. In 1985, a man named Andrew Thornton was flying a small plane over the southeastern United States. But this wasn't a normal flight, because packed inside the aircraft were duffel bags filled with cocaine. Thornton was a former narcotics officer who had become a drug smuggler, someone who knew exactly how law enforcement worked, because he used to be part of it. That night, as he flew over the wilderness, something went wrong. Realizing he was in trouble, Thornton began throwing the drug-filled bags out of the plane, one after another. They disappeared into the forest below. Then, he jumped, parachute on his back, millions of dollars in drugs falling around him. But there was one problem. His parachute failed. Days later, Andrew Thornton was found dead in a driveway in Tennessee, still wearing expensive gear, still carrying drugs, and surrounded by cash. Now on its own, that story is already bizarre. But investigators soon discovered something even stranger deep inside Chattahoochee National Forest. A black bear, dead. At first glance, it looked ordinary, until the autopsy revealed what was inside its stomach. Cocaine, a massive amount of it. Investigators believed the bear had discovered one of the fallen duffel bags, torn it open, and eaten the contents. The amount consumed was far beyond what any animal or person could survive. And just like that, the bear became part of one of the strangest true crime stories in American history. Eventually, the animal was taxidermied, displayed publicly, and given the nickname Cocaine Bear. Now the story sounds fake, like something invented for a movie. But every major part of it actually happened. A drug smuggler falling from the sky, millions in cocaine scattered through the forest, and an innocent animal wandering into the aftermath of human crime. Because sometimes, the chaos people create doesn't stay with people. Sometimes, it spills into the wild, and whatever finds it next pays the price. This is a story about a group of military officers who went into a forest expecting to find a crashed aircraft. But instead, they encountered something they still can't explain more than 40 years later. In December of 1980, U.S. Air Force personnel stationed in England began noticing strange lights falling through the sky near a place called Rendlesham Forest. Now, this wasn't just any forest. It sat directly between two NATO military bases, which meant if something unidentified came down out there, it was taken seriously. So security patrols were sent in to investigate. At first, the officers assumed they were looking for a downed aircraft, maybe a small plane, maybe military equipment. But as they moved deeper into the trees, they started noticing something strange. The lights weren't stationary, they were moving. Quietly, deliberately, and then suddenly, through the darkness, they saw it. A glowing object resting among the trees. One officer later described it as triangular in shape, roughly 9 feet long, metallic, covered in strange symbols that didn't resemble any known language. And as they slowly approached it, the object reacted. Without warning, it began moving through the forest. Not crashing through branches, not making engine noise, just silently weaving between the trees, almost like it knew exactly where they were. The officers chased after it, trying to keep it in sight. But eventually, it disappeared into the darkness. Now, normally, a story like this would probably be dismissed immediately, except for one thing. There were records, military records. Investigators later took radiation readings at the alleged landing site and reportedly found levels higher than normal background radiation. Then another officer came forward with an even stranger claim. He said beams of light had descended from the sky directly into the base's weapons storage area. And unlike most UFO stories, this one generated official paperwork. A memo was filed, signed, documented by military personnel. But despite that, higher authorities eventually dismissed the incident. Some suggested the lights were from a nearby lighthouse. Others blamed confusion, stress, or misidentifications in the dark. Skeptics say the entire thing was a chain reaction of fear and assumption. But the people involved still stand by what they saw. And that's what makes this case so unsettling. These weren't random civilians. They weren't ghost hunters or conspiracy theorists. They were trained military officers, people specifically taught how to identify threats, aircraft, and unusual activity. And decades later, many of them still insist they encountered something that should not have been there. Because when multiple soldiers trained to stay calm under pressure, all described the same impossible event. You have to wonder, what exactly moved through those trees that night in Rendlesham Forest? This is a story about an explosion so powerful, it flattened an entire forest, shattered windows hundreds of miles away, and lit up the sky like the end of the world. But when investigators arrived at the scene, they found something impossible. There was no crater, no impact site, and no clear explanation for what had caused it. On the morning of June 30th, 1908, people across Siberia looked up and saw something terrifying. A blazing object ripping across the sky. Witnesses described it as brighter than the sun. A massive fireball moving at incredible speed over the remote wilderness of Tunguska. Then, without warning, the sky exploded. The blast was catastrophic. People standing more than 40 miles away were thrown to the ground. Windows shattered hundreds of miles from the explosion. Some witnesses said it felt like the earth itself had cracked open. Others described a shockwave that rolled through the landscape like a living thing. And then came the silence. Now, because the area was so remote, it took scientists years to properly investigate the site. But when they finally arrived, what they found was astonishing. More than 80 million trees had been flattened, entire sections of forest laid out on the ground like matchsticks. And every single tree pointed away from one central area, as if something enormous had detonated above them. But there was one major problem. There was no crater, no impact hole, no large meteorite fragments. Nothing. It was as if the object had vanished before ever touching the Earth. Researchers eventually concluded that whatever entered the atmosphere must have exploded in midair. An airburst, and the estimated force of that explosion was staggering. Hundreds of times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Now, over the years, theories about the Tunguska event have become increasingly strange. Some believed it was a meteor. Others suggested a comet fragment. There were theories involving secret weapons, alien spacecraft, even antimatter. And some of the strangest reports came from people living far away from the blast. Across parts of Europe, people claimed the night sky glowed unnaturally bright for days afterward. Atmospheric effects appeared thousands of miles from Siberia, as though the explosion had disturbed the planet itself. Today, most scientists believe an asteroid exploded high in the atmosphere before reaching the ground. But even with that explanation, the story remains deeply unsettling. Because the only reason this wasn't one of the deadliest disasters in human history is location. If that object had exploded over a major city, millions of people could have died instantly. Because Earth wasn't spared that day. It was lucky. And maybe it was warned. This is a story about a group of divers who were searching a shipwreck for treasure. But instead, they discovered a machine so advanced, it appeared to rewrite history itself. In 1901, sponge divers working off the coast of Antikythera descended into the ruins of an ancient Roman shipwreck. At first, the discovery seemed straightforward. Bronze statues, pottery, coins, the kinds of artifacts you'd expect from a lost ship resting underwater for thousands of years. But buried among those objects was something strange, a small lump of corroded bronze. At first glance, it looked insignificant, just another ruined piece of metal destroyed by the sea. So it was collected with everything else and largely ignored, until years later, when researchers began cleaning it. As the corrosion slowly came away, they noticed something impossible. Gears. tiny, intricate gears, dozens of them, perfectly cut, interlocking like the inside of a modern clock. And that's when historians realized this wasn't decoration. It was a machine that was more than 2,000 years old. Now, that alone would have been shocking. But then researchers figured out what it actually did. The device could track the movement of celestial bodies, predict eclipses, map the phases of the moon, even calculate planetary cycles. It was, essentially, a mechanical computer, built around 100 BCE. And here's why that terrified historians. Technology like this wasn't supposed to exist yet. Complex gear systems of this precision were believed to have appeared more than 1,000 years later, during the Middle Ages. But somehow, ancient Greek engineers had already built one, and not just a crude version, something astonishingly advanced. So advanced, in fact, that for years, scientists struggled to believe it was real. Because if people could build machines like this in the ancient world, then what else did they know? And what else was lost? What makes the Antikythera mechanism even stranger is that no other device like it has ever been found. No factory, no workshop, no detailed instructions, almost no surviving texts explaining how it was created. It's as if the knowledge required to build it simply vanished. An entire technological tradition, gone. And that raises an unsettling possibility. Maybe history isn't just incomplete. Maybe entire chapters of human achievement have disappeared completely. Because sometimes, history doesn't only hide secrets. Sometimes, it erases them. This is a story about a message that may have come from deep space. It lasted just 72 seconds. It was heard exactly once. And despite decades of searching, no one has ever found it again. On the night of August 15th, 1977, a massive radio telescope known as the Big Ear was quietly scanning the sky. Its mission was simple. Listen, not for voices, not for spacecraft, but for unusual radio signals that might reveal something unexpected about the universe. Most nights were uneventful. The telescope recorded the usual background noise, natural radio emissions from stars, galaxies, and distant cosmic objects. Nothing remarkable, nothing mysterious. Then, a few days later, an astronomer named Jerry Eman sat down to review the data. And that's when he saw it, a sequence of characters on a computer printout. At first glance, it looked ordinary, but the more he studied it, the more impossible it seemed. The signal was incredibly powerful, far stronger than the random noise astronomers typically detected, and it appeared to originate from the direction of Sagittarius. What made it so unusual was how perfectly it behaved. The signal gradually increased in strength, reached a peak, then faded away. Exactly the pattern scientists would expect if a distant transmission had passed through the telescope's field of view. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't random. It looked deliberate. Shocked by what he was seeing, Eman grabbed a pen, circled the data, and wrote a single word in the margin. Wow. The name stuck. The wow signal. Immediately, scientists wanted answers. They pointed telescopes back toward the same region of space. Nothing. They searched again. Nothing. Weeks passed, then months, then years, and the signal never returned, not once. Now, over the decades, researchers have proposed countless explanations. A comet passing through the area, an unusual natural radio source, a malfunction in the equipment. But every explanation seemed to leave questions unanswered, because the signal possessed characteristics that were surprisingly difficult to explain away. And that's why, nearly 50 years later, the WOW signal remains one of the most famous mysteries in astronomy. Was it a natural phenomenon that scientists simply haven't identified yet? A rare cosmic event that happened only once? Or was it something else? Something intelligent? Something distant? Something trying to be heard? No one knows. And maybe the most unsettling part isn't that we detected the signal. It's that if it really was a message, we never got a second one. And somewhere in the vast darkness beyond Earth, whatever sent it may have been waiting for a reply. This is a story about a man who interrupted live television. Not once, but twice. He wore a rubber mask, spoke in distorted nonsense, appeared on screens across an entire city, and then disappeared forever. To this day, no one knows who he was. On the night of November 22nd, 1987, people in Chicago were sitting at home watching television like normal. One station was airing a live sports segment. Everything seemed routine. Then suddenly, the screen went black. For a few seconds, there was nothing. And then, a figure appeared. He was wearing a warped rubber mask that resembled Max Headroom, a popular digital TV character from the 1980s. Behind him, a strange metallic background rotated slowly. The figure twitched unnaturally, laughed, mumbled distorted phrases in a buzzing electronic voice. And for viewers watching live, it felt surreal, like someone had hijacked reality itself. Inside the television station, engineers were scrambling, because this wasn't a prank inserted into programming. Someone had actually overpowered the station's broadcast signal, which in 1987 required serious technical knowledge and expensive equipment. Then just as suddenly as it started, the signal cut out. The regular program returned. Most viewers assumed they had just witnessed a bizarre glitch. But later that same night, it happened again. Another Chicago station, another live broadcast, and once again, the masked figure appeared. Only this time, the interruption lasted longer. Much longer. The figure rambled incoherently, mocked television personalities, held strange objects toward the camera. At times, he seemed playful. At other moments, completely unhinged. And then the broadcast took a darker turn. At one point, the figure bent forward, while someone off camera appeared to strike him with a fly swatter. The audio crackled. The masked man screamed dramatically, and then, without warning, the signal died. Gone. Immediately afterward, television stations contacted authorities. The FBI launched an investigation because hijacking a live broadcast signal wasn't easy, especially in the 1980s. Whoever did this understood broadcasting technology well enough to interrupt major TV stations in real time. And yet, despite national attention, despite investigators analyzing the footage, the person responsible was never identified. No arrests, no credible suspects, no confession, nothing. To this day, the Max Headroom signal hijacking remains one of the strangest unsolved television intrusions ever recorded. Just a faceless person, briefly taking control of live television before vanishing into history. And maybe the creepiest part isn't what he said. It's the realization that somewhere out there, someone proved they could reach through the screen and interrupt reality itself. This is a story about a radio station that almost never plays music, never broadcasts news, and for nearly half a century has transmitted the same eerie sound every minute of every day. No one outside a small circle of people knows exactly why. And right now, while you're listening to this story, it's still on the air. Somewhere in Russia, a radio station broadcasts on a frequency known as UVB-76. To most people, that name means nothing. But to radio enthusiasts around the world, it's known by a far more unsettling nickname, the buzzer. Because if you tune in, you won't hear voices, you won't hear music, You'll hear a buzzing sound, a mechanical drone, repeated over and over, every few seconds, day and night, week after week, year after year. The signal first appeared during the Cold War, and from the beginning, it was strange. No station identification, no explanation, just the buzz. At first, people assumed it was military, some sort of communications channel, maybe a navigation beacon, maybe a technical signal. But then, something happened. Every so often, without warning, the buzzing would stop. The frequency would fall silent, and then a voice would appear, usually speaking in Russian, calm, precise, reading lists of names, strings of numbers, random words, codes that seemed meaningless to everyone listening. Then, just as suddenly, the voice would disappear, and the buzzing would begin again, as if nothing had happened. No explanation, no context, just a brief interruption in an otherwise endless drone. Naturally, people became obsessed. Amateur radio operators around the world started monitoring the frequency, recording it, analyzing it, trying to figure out who was behind it. Some researchers traced the signal to locations associated with the Russian military. Others claimed to hear strange things between broadcasts, background conversations, footsteps, doors opening and closing, the sound of papers moving, as though someone, somewhere, had accidentally left a microphone on, and those small clues only fueled the mystery. Over time, theories multiplied. Some believed the station was part of a military communications network. Others suggested it was connected to strategic defense systems. And one theory stood out above all the others: the idea that the signal acted as a kind of heartbeat, a constant indication that operators were still active, still alive, still in control. According to this theory, if the buzzing ever stopped permanently, it wouldn't be a technical problem. It would mean something had gone terribly wrong, something serious enough that no one was left to keep the signal running. Now, there is evidence that the station has ties to military communications, and many experts believe it serves a practical purpose rather than anything supernatural. But the exact purpose has never been publicly explained. And after decades of monitoring, the mystery remains. Because unlike most mysteries, this one isn't hidden in the past. It isn't buried underground. And it isn't locked away in an archive. It's happening right now, at this very moment, somewhere on a radio frequency. The buzz continues, steady, unchanging, relentless. And perhaps the creepiest part is knowing that while countless people have listened, speculated, and investigated, almost nobody can say with certainty what it's actually for, because the most unsettling signal isn't the one that vanished. It's the one that's still broadcasting and may never stop. In the summer of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, a woman walked into the street and started dancing. At first, nobody thought much of it. Maybe she was celebrating. Maybe she was entertaining herself. But as the hours passed, people began to notice something strange. She wasn't stopping. There was no music, no audience, no reason, just endless dancing. Historical records identify her as Frau Trophäa. By nightfall, she was still dancing. The next morning, she was still dancing, exhausted, sweating, barely able to stand, yet somehow unable to stop. And then things got even stranger, because within days, other people began joining her. 1 became 5. 5 became 20. 20 became dozens. Soon, entire groups of people were dancing through the streets, not joyfully, not willingly. Witnesses described people moving with expressions of fear and pain. Some dancers collapsed from exhaustion. Others continued despite swollen legs, bleeding feet, and extreme dehydration. According to historical accounts, some people reportedly died. Heart failure, stroke, pure exhaustion. The city authorities were desperate, but instead of stopping the dancing, they made a decision that sounds unbelievable today. They thought the victims needed to dance it out. So they hired musicians, built stages, and encouraged the dancers to keep moving. It was a disaster. The outbreak only grew larger. More dancers, more suffering, more confusion. No one understood what was happening. Eventually, officials abandoned the idea and transported many of the dancers to a religious shrine outside the city. And then, just as mysteriously as it began, the phenomenon faded. The dancers stopped. The streets returned to normal. And life went on. More than 500 years later, no one knows exactly what caused it. Some historians believe it was mass hysteria triggered by extreme stress and hardship. Others point to poisoned grain contaminated by a hallucinogenic fungus. Religious panic. Psychological contagion. Every theory explains part of the story, but none explain all of it. Because one fact remains incredibly difficult to ignore. Large numbers of people really did dance for days, sometimes weeks, until their bodies gave out, and nobody could tell them why, which raises a chilling possibility. What if the most contagious thing in the world isn't a disease, but an idea? And what if, for one terrifying summer in Strasbourg, that idea spread through an entire city? This is a story about a young pilot who took off on a routine flight. Halfway through the journey, he radioed air traffic control and reported something strange, something flying above him. Minutes later, his transmission ended with a sound no one could explain, and neither he nor his plane were ever seen again. On October 21st, 1978, 20-year-old Frederick Valentich departed from Melbourne for a flight to King Island. He was alone. The weather was good. Visibility was clear. Nothing about the flight appeared unusual. It should have been routine. But at around 7 p.m., everything changed. Frederick contacted air traffic control. At first, his transmission sounded calm, professional. Then he asked an odd question. Was there any known aircraft operating below 5,000 feet in his area? The controller checked. The answer came back immediately. No, there shouldn't have been. But Frederick didn't seem reassured, because according to him, something was there. He reported seeing an aircraft above him, one he couldn't identify. And the more he described it, the stranger the conversation became. According to the radio transcripts, the object appeared to have 4 bright lights. It moved at tremendous speed. At times, it approached his plane. At other moments, it seemed to circle overhead. Frederick struggled to explain what he was seeing. The object appeared shiny, metallic, unlike any aircraft he recognized. As the minutes passed, his voice began to change. The confidence faded. Confusion took its place. And then concern, because whatever was out there wasn't behaving like a normal airplane. At one point, Frederick described it as if it were intentionally maneuvering around him, watching him, playing some kind of game. Then came the statement that would make the case famous, a statement still discussed decades later. Frederick paused and said, "It's not an aircraft." A few moments later, air traffic control heard an unusual sound, a harsh metallic noise, like scraping metal, grinding, static mixed with something mechanical. It continued for several seconds. Then suddenly, the transmission stopped. No goodbye, no distress call, just silence. Repeated attempts to contact Frederick failed. He never responded. Search crews were dispatched immediately. They searched the waters of the Bass Strait. Aircraft combed the area. Ships searched below. Nothing. No wreckage, no fuel slick, no emergency beacon, no body. It was as if both the pilot and the airplane had simply vanished. Over the years, investigators proposed explanations. Some suggested Frederick may have become disoriented. Perhaps he mistook reflections from his own aircraft lights on the water for another object. Others theorized he entered an unusual flight attitude and lost control. It's a scenario that aviation experts say can happen surprisingly quickly, but not everyone is convinced, because the final radio transmissions remain deeply unusual, and unlike many disappearances, there's no wreckage to examine, no definitive evidence, just a recording, a strange metallic sound, and a pilot insisting he was looking at something that shouldn't have been there. To this day, nobody knows exactly what Frederick Voynich saw that night, or why neither he nor his aircraft were ever found. Because if Frederick was mistaken, then where did the plane go? And if he wasn't, what exactly was waiting for him in the darkness above?